Good morning and welcome to Is Our Democracy in Danger? I should probably state up front that I am not a historian or political scientist by training, so I have no real authority on this subject except that I've spent months trying to answer the question for myself of what makes a democratic government functional and sustainable. And how would we know if our democracy was failing? Also, I recognize this subject has some potential for contention, but I think this subject is important and worth the risk. I've done everything I can to be balanced about this, and if past versions of this course are any guide, about 90% of you will think this is a helpful and balanced civics lesson. But about 10% of you will think I am totally biased. And for those who find themselves in that 10%, this will be a tough course for you to absorb. And all I can suggest is that you do your best to keep an open mind and perhaps see this as an opportunity to question your own biases and the news sources that you use. But if you do have a specific piece of information that says I'm in error, forward it to me and I will do my best to respond. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. In the past, I have attempted some class participation, but from that experience, I've found with a large audience, both live and on Zoom, that participation becomes clumsy. So I've decided to make this a straight lecture course. However, I also recognize that you still may have questions along the way, and for the folks in the room, I have handed out some 4x6 cards. Whenever you have a question, write it on the card and deliver it to the manila envelope at the back of the room. I will review those questions over the coming week and start the next class with an attempt to address those questions. If you have no questions, simply return the card to the envelope. And if you are on Zoom, your question will need to be submitted to me by email. I want to remind everyone that I am broadcasting this on Zoom. I should be clear that there is no restriction based on your registration, whether you participate by Zoom or live in the A&E. Zoom is offered as a convenience for those who need it, and there should be no hesitation to move back and forth between the classroom and Zoom as your situation requires. Zoom also allows me to record each session so I can post it on YouTube. So after each session, I will email the link to everyone, and you use it when you miss a class, but also feel free to share it with friends and family. Finally, I would mention that the class is large enough that I am not going to keep attendance. There is no need to inform me if you cannot make a class. So let us begin. Over the past several years, you may have heard all kinds of people wondering whether our democracy is in danger. We've certainly seen a lot of activity over the past few years that is really unprecedented. And some of what has occurred is recognized as precursors to democratic crisis in other countries. I think we would all like to believe that our Constitution, our beliefs about freedom and equality, our historically healthy middle class, our high levels of wealth and education, and our large diversified private sector should protect us from the kind of democratic breakdown we have seen in other countries. Things can't be that bad here, right? The guardrails, they're still in place, right? Maybe, maybe not. So we have a lot of civics to cover today to prep you for the following weeks. And while there are many delightful videos on the internet on this subject, we are not doing any of those today. Today will be lecture, so you stand forewarned. So what are we going to be learning? Here is our roadmap. We will begin today talking about the value of democracy and provide some comparison to other forms of government. We all use the word democracy pretty freely, but really, what are we talking about? What are those elements or components that define a democracy? We're going to spend a good part of today discussing those elements. You can make up all the rules you like about how a democratic government should work, But rules cannot govern every situation. What is required is established norms of appropriate behavior. Norms are shared codes of conduct that become common knowledge within a society, accepted, respected, and enforced by its members. We're going to identify those norms specific to a democracy and talk about their importance. And once we understand how a democracy is supposed to operate, we can then talk about how democracies are subverted. The techniques for subverting a democracy are fairly standard. After we talk about this, you'll be qualified to go out and subvert your own democracy, or better yet, know better how to protect one. The bulk of this course will be dedicated to reviewing the elements of our democracy and how they are being impacted by the dynamics and politics of modern U.S. society. So in quick review, we'll be talking about voting rights and electoral legitimacy, the most fundamental feature of a democracy. From there, we will focus on the following subjects and their impact on democracy. Money and politics. Money affects not only who gets elected, but how politicians behave once in office. This has consequences for our democracy. Erosion of norms. The unofficial guardrails of our democracy are slipping. Polarization. Political polarization that is intensifying since 1994. We will talk about the impact on our democracy. Economic inequality. Generally, high economic inequality is recognized as something that is not healthy for a society. Counter-majoritarian institutions. Counter-majoritarian institutions are ones where the winner is not the one with the most votes. The United States has a number of those non-democratic institutions that we need to talk about. The rule of law, second only to voting rights for defining a democracy. There is a rising trend towards violence as the means of social change rather than the rule of law. A peaceful transfer of power. A peaceful transfer of power has been the norm up until January 6, 2021. Human rights and liberties. The U.S. has done a good job documenting citizens' rights and liberties in the law and establishing the institutions to defend them. The challenge has been extending these rights and liberties to ethnic and cultural minorities. The evolution of the Republican Party. One of the more dramatic changes of the past 50 years is how the composition of the Republican Party has changed. This is leading in a less democratic direction for the party. Republican commitment to democracy. There are three basic principles that all politicians who are loyal Democrats must be guided by. We will look at how Republicans are faring against those principles. And what about Democrats? Republicans' commitment to democracy seems shaky. However, Democrats are not without fault. We will look at that also. Finally, we will finish by looking at some polling on our attitudes and commitment to democracy and examining how our personal and cultural commitments affect the sustainability of our democracy. So, democracy and its alternatives. One of the most interesting things I learned in researching this is that most of us in the US assume democracies die by some kind of military takeover, somewhat like what we saw in Chile when General Augusto Pinochet took over from the democratically elected Salvador Allende. But it is much more common that democracies die at the hands of the country's elected leaders. It is the presidents and prime ministers who subvert the very process that brought them to power. Many government efforts to subvert democracy are thought of as legal in the sense that they are approved by the legislature or the courts. They are often portrayed as efforts to improve democracy, to create a more efficient judiciary, or to clean up an electoral process. But the actual result is the consolidation of power, that is, of decision-making away from the people and into the hands of a single ruler. And it is not like this understanding is some new revelation. Alexander Hamilton recognized this when he said, "Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending as tyrants." And Madeleine Albright pointed out how we can all have a role in the failure of democracy. The desire for liberty may be ingrained in every human breast, but so is the potential for complacency, confusion, and cowardice. What you need to understand that democracies are not vanquished by the actions of the military or even a lone autocrat. It takes a complicit and divided legislature, court system, and civil society to let leaders get away with subverting democracy. In other words, it takes all of us to let democracy slip away. So why does it matter whether we have a democracy or not? Why should we worry about this? Now, here's what Winston Churchill had to say back in 1947. He said, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe, and no one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." So what are those forms of government that have been tried from time to time? Now, democracy is unique because the ultimate authority is held by the citizenry. The opposite of democracy is referred to as an authoritarianism, where some individual or group holds the ultimate authority, and it typically values social stability of the personal freedom valued by a democracy. Here are various forms of authoritarian alternatives that have existed. Each type of government is defined by who rules, who is the ultimate authority. So a dictatorship is ruled by one person, a totalitarian government is ruled by one party, a theocracy, one religion, an oligarchy is ruled by the wealthy, aristocracy means rule by some specified elite, perhaps the educated, or maybe the business class. Monarchy, a king or queen. One other type of government not listed here is not considered authoritarian because no one is in charge. It's called anarchy and does not get much attention because it does not seem to be able to succeed on a large scale. Authoritarian governments ruled by a dictator are most common and tend to rise when economic, social, political, or religious change makes members of a formerly powerful group feel as if they have been left behind. Their frustration makes them vulnerable to leaders who promise to make them dominant again. A strong man downplays the real conditions that have created their problems and tells them the only reasons they have been pushed aside is that enemies have cheated them of their power. You may hear people make a distinction between democracy and a republic, but that is a distinction without too much of a difference. Now, prior to the 17th century, the term republic was used to designate any state that was not a dictatorship. Now it is understood to be any form of government in which the state is ruled by representatives of the citizens. And while there is such thing as a direct democracy where citizens all meet in one forum to arrive at a decision, that is not very practical in a country of 300 million people. A democracy today is understood to be representative and thus a republic. A democratic republic means that the representatives are chosen by those they represent. Now, a republic could be non-democratic, which means that the representatives are chosen by some other method than by the people they represent. In fact, at its inception, the U.S. determined its senators and presidents by non-democratic means. and we will talk about that a little later. In today's world, the words democracy and republic are pretty much interchangeable, but to be totally correct, we are a democratic republic. Here are some other terms you may have heard when people talk about types of government. Autocracy is a style of government in which supreme power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual. His or her decisions are not restricted by legal constraints, so their power is unlimited. So it is equivalent to a dictatorship. Fascism is a style of government that exalts nations and often race above the individual. This results in a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. Now, these terms describe economic systems, but often are associated with types of political systems. So you have capitalism. It's an economic system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Socialism is an economic system in which property and the means of production are owned in common by the government. The expectation is that all citizens will share equally in economic resources as allocated by a democratically elected government. Communism, like socialism, is an economic system in which property and the means of production are owned in common, but there is no expectation of citizen input. The actual government will be dictatorial or totalitarian. Now, Marxism is an economic philosophy that argues for workers to overturn capitalism in favor of communism. While there are plenty of alternatives to a democratic republic, I think you can see that most alternatives are considered to be authoritarian-style governments. That is, they favor enforcing strict obedience to authority, especially that of the government, at the expense of personal freedom. Additionally, they have a shared hostility to individualism, representative government, laissez-faire capitalism, and the decadence they associate with modern culture. That is, the rulers assume they know best and make the decisions accordingly. Now, democracy is also a philosophy. Underpinning the idea of democracy is the belief that freedom is the heart's desire and the natural state of all people. It is believed that for each of us to live fully, it is necessary for us to be in control of our own destiny. It is also assumed that all human beings are equal and deserving of this freedom. Now, historically, there have been some debates about who exactly are considered to be human beings and who is better than whom and entitled to rule, but the general trend has been towards greater inclusiveness. After all, it's embedded in our Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and many minority groups use this as their leverage to make America live up to its promise. Further, it is believed that human beings can be trusted with freedom and trusted to successfully decide things for themselves, both individually and in groups. Now, these beliefs have radical implications. They imply the freedom of individuals to make their own plans, to express their own opinions, and to participate in public life. This freedom depends on possession of economic and political rights, which are protected by social and governmental institutions, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But we also know that human nature has a couple of flaws that are likely to blossom in a free society if they are not restrained. So first, the craving for power and wealth leads society's most cunning and ambitious people to find ways to cheat and corrupt the system. And two, we are all prone to behavior that is groupish. That is, we favor our own groups over others. And this can lead to intolerance and discrimination. Democracy is an attempt to construct a government that supports this belief in freedom for individuals and yet provides restraints on our human flaws. So accepting all this, what are the necessary elements of a government that provides the maximum amount of personal freedom, trusting people to make their own decisions, yet still restraining those flaws in our character that lead to corruption and discrimination? If democracy is the answer, what are the elements of a democracy that make it the answer? The first and perhaps most important element is elections and voting. The most basic definition of democracy is rule by the people. So the most fundamental building block of a democracy is defining a system that allows the people to express their will. Now, clearly, with a country with millions of citizens, they cannot meet in a town square and hash out the issues. Thus, it becomes essential to find a system for choosing representatives and peacefully change their government when it is required. The recognized best practice for doing this is through a system of universal voting by secret ballot. The results of the voting are understood to represent the will of the people. While in this country we take voting and elections for granted, elections were an innovation. Historically, there were often no way to remove the power from office without immense violence and upheaval. Elections were a great leap forward that changed all that. And once implemented, it was important that elections be held regularly to ensure no one was elected ruler for life. Since voting is so central to the operation of a democracy, it is essential that institutions be established for regularly scheduled elections that protect the voting rights of all citizens and that the final results reflect honest vote totals. That is, the legitimacy of the voting must be beyond question. And every politician must accept the results of those elections, win or lose. It needs to be understood that democratic decision-making is by majority rule. That is, 50% plus one can make decisions that will be binding upon all. The next element is respect for human rights and liberties. A democracy recognizes there is a sphere of life surrounding each of us in which we should be able to think and do what we like. This begins with protecting those freedoms we know so well: speech, press, association, assembly, belief, and religion. Additionally, a democracy must keep the arbitrary power of the state at bay. Citizens need to know that their rights and liberties are documented and embedded in law, and they will not be deprived of life or liberty for criticizing the powerful or rallying the opposition. But in diverse societies like ours, protection for individual citizens must go further than that. To lead dignified and self-determined lives, citizens must also know that neither the state nor their fellow citizens will persecute them based on their identity. It's not enough for the state to refrain from persecuting its own citizens based on their political views, their religious convictions, or their sexual orientation. It must take active steps to protect minority communities from oppression by non-state actors. In a free society, members of all groups must be able to be true to their own identity without fear of persecution by either the state or their fellow citizens. Historically, countries with diverse populations struggle to treat all their citizens equally. Typically, there is a majority group who, for historic, religious, or ethnic reasons, feel they have contributed the most to the development of the country and should be more equal than others. And if allowed to, will seek to oppress those who are not part of their group. This is commonly known as the tyranny of the majority, and it is a potential weakness of a democracy that must be addressed. In theory, this should be easy for the United States. Our declared loyalty is not to a historic group, shared faith, or common enemy, but to a set of values as set forth in the Constitution. All elected officials, as well as new citizens, swear to support and defend those constitutional values. But in reality, we have a white Christian heritage that has led to contentious debates about the place of African Americans, immigrants, and other minorities in our society. Thus, the importance of documenting the rights and liberties for all citizens in the law and establishing the institutions that will defend those rights. The next element is civic participation. A democracy allows for and facilitates active participation by its citizenry. This means a lively civil society made up of independent associations, social movements, university, and publications which enable citizens to lobby for their interests. Additionally, it means a varied system of political parties and organizations that represent different viewpoints along the political spectrum. Furthermore, it means that everyone is free to run for office with vigorous and energetic campaigns, and running for office is open to all. It's not limited to some special elite. In order to facilitate full participation, a democracy needs an informed public and prioritizes education for all of its citizens. An educational system provides young people with information and skills so they can make informed decisions, as well as secure economic independence for themselves. Next, a democracy requires a free and independent media. The press, first and foremost, is intended to serve the people, not the government. The independence of the media from the government is one of the most significant characteristics of a democracy. Media in a democracy play several key roles which cannot be interfered with by the government. It serves as a source of reliable and a shared set of facts. If we do not have the capacity to distinguish what is true from what is false, then by definition, the marketplace of ideas doesn't work, and thus our democracy cannot function. It provides the means for citizens to be educated and informed. Active citizen participation is not possible without an educated citizenry. It serves as a watchdog upon various government entities. Through investigative reporting, the media provides transparency and accountability for those officials who engage in corruption. And it plays an active role in the public debates through hosting opinion columnists and writing editorials. Okay, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, which defines and limits the powers of the state over its citizens. It enshrines the civil and political rights of citizens, and these rights are defined in the Constitution's Bill of Rights. It further defines the obligations of the government and establishes the fundamental governing principles. These principles are enforced above all other laws, and it is the beginning of what we call the rule of law. Our Constitution defines a system of separate branches of government that ensures political power is not concentrated in the hands of a single branch. As you may remember from high school civics, we have three branches of government defined in the Constitution: a president, a Congress, and a Supreme Court. Each branch is designed to check the power of the other, and this is known as checks and balances. The Congress is divided into two bodies, the House of Representatives and a Senate. This was a compromise arrived at by our founding fathers who worried that democracies could unleash emotional mobs that would overcome the cool, deliberative reasoning that they valued, while the members of the House of Representatives were directly elected by the people and captured the popular passions of the day. Senators were initially appointed by the states, so they would be a serious deliberative body, intended to be a cooling mechanism to ensure reasonable majorities would prevail. Today, senators are also directly elected, and the peaceful transfer of power and the rule are essential elements of a functioning democratic government. I want to expand on these two bullets. One of the keystones of a democracy is allowing for the peaceful transfer of power from one leader to another. The Constitution does not explicitly say there will be a peaceful transition of presidential power. What it does tell us is that we are to hold free and fair elections and that the winner will become the president. Election laws further provide rules for counting and resolving legal challenges to the ballot before that transfer. The framers put this in writing because they knew that citizens had to see the electoral process as legitimate and fair if the transition was to work. While elections are needed, peaceful transitions also require some strong democratic norms to exist. Specifically, the loser of an election must be willing to concede victory to an opponent and to serve as the loyal opposition going forward. The alternative is the chaos we see in other countries when there are no solid and accepted rules about how to transition government power. Various factions end up vying for power through demonstrations and violence. The rule of law means a number of things. While government officials swear allegiance to the Constitution, they are recognizing the rule of law and its principles, not a party and not a leader. It is the first implementation of the idea that all citizens are equal and that no one is above the law. That is, the laws and procedures apply equally to all citizens, including those who hold positions of power. Political change occurs through established institutions, not by violence. Thus, we have an elaborate elections infrastructure, legislatures, and judiciary to facilitate peaceful change. The rule of law provides protections from an all-powerful state, arresting you or detaining you without just cause, and you are innocent until proven guilty. It constrains the power of majorities, that is, the protecting of the rights found in the Bill of Rights, and minority rights are respected by legal and institutional means. The law is clear, known, and enforced. That is, the rules are predictable, not arbitrary. As an aside to that, property rights must be protected and contracts enforced. Freedom means the ability to buy, sell, and invest freely in a market economy. No entrepreneur will risk his money in a business if there are not legal institutions to lower the risk of trade and investment with strangers. The rule of law seeks to minimize corruption. It is essential that public trust their elected leaders and civil servants, that is, their police officers and the judges. They trust them to perform their jobs without bribery or criminality. Thus, transparency is essential. How officials conduct the public business and spend money must be readily available and easily understood. Finally, the rule of law requires a judiciary independent of the government. Judges must have the freedom to decide cases impartially based on their interpretation of the law and the facts, and not by who they are politically indebted to. Okay, so we have a great constitution with many safeguards. Is that enough to secure a democracy? We think probably not. And this is true for several reasons. Constitutions are always incomplete. No operating manual, no matter how detailed, can anticipate all possible contingencies or prescribe how to behave under all possible circumstances. Constitutional rules are always subject to competing interpretations. So, for example, what exactly does advice and consent mean in appointing Supreme Court justices? Does this mean the Senate must hold a vote on a president's nomination? Or does advice and consent allow the Senate to choose not to hold a vote? If constitutional powers are open to multiple readings, they can be used in ways their creators did not anticipate. The written words of the Constitution may be followed to the letter, yet still undermine the spirit of the law. So, for example, the president is obligated to fill the leadership positions in independent agencies such as the FBI or the Federal Reserve. However, we have few constitutional safeguards against filling those positions with political loyalists. So if constitutions do not secure democracy, what does? Democracies work best and survive longest when constitutions are reinforced by unwritten democratic norms. Now, norms are a shared codes of conduct that become common knowledge within a society. They are kind of like the air we breathe. It's definitely there, but sort of invisible. When they exist, they nudge us to certain behaviors without us feeling particularly pressured. It feels like this is just the way things are done. America's checks and balances among the branches of government have been preserved by two basic norms among our legislators: mutual toleration and institutional forbearance. These two have served as guardrails for our representatives, helping them to avoid the kind of partisan fights to the death that has destroyed democracies elsewhere in the world. Mutual toleration refers to the idea that as long as our rivals play by the constitutional rules, we accept that they have an equal right to exist, compete for power, and to govern. This means recognizing that our political rivals are decent, patriotic, law-abiding citizens, that they love our country and respect the Constitution just as we do. Even though we may think that their ideas to be foolish or wrong-headed, we do not view them as an existential threat. Now, as commonsensical as this idea may sound, the belief that political opponents are not enemies is a remarkably sophisticated invention. Historically, it is much more common for those in power to consider the opposition to be treasonous. Both sides in America's early partisan battles regarded each other as a threat to the republic. However, over the course of decades, America's opposing parties came to the hard-fought recognition that they could be rivals and not enemies. This recognition was a critical foundation for the growth of American democracy. When norms of mutual toleration are weak, democracy is hard to sustain. If we view our rivals as dangerous, we have much to fear if they are elected, and we may decide to employ any means necessary to defeat them. And therein lies a justification for authoritarian methods and violence. In most cases of democratic breakdown, would-be authoritarians have justified their consolidation of power by labeling their opponents as a life or death danger. A second norm critical to democracy's survival is referred to as institutional forbearance. And forbearance means the action of restraining from exercising a legal right. Institutional forbearance can be thought of as avoiding actions that, while allowed by the letter of the law, violate its spirit. For example, a single senator can slow the Senate to a halt by objecting to all unanimous consent requests. Senators have the power to do this, but forbearance discourages them from overusing that power. Restraint avoids antagonizing other senators and endangering future cooperation. When norms of forbearance are strong, politicians do not use their institutional prerogatives to the hilt, even if it's technically legal to do so, for such action could imperil the entire system. Think of democracy as a game that we want to keep on playing indefinitely. To ensure future rounds of the games, players must refrain from either incapacitating the other team or antagonizing them to such a degree that they refuse to play again tomorrow. In politics, this often means avoiding dirty tricks or hardball tactics in the name of civility and fair play. Social, economic, racial, or religious differences can cause societies to sort themselves into political camps with different worldviews and values. This is known as polarization. The most extreme version of polarization is called tribalism, when parties view one another as mortal enemies. Losing ceases to be a routine part of the political process, but instead becomes a full-blown catastrophe. When that happens, toleration becomes harder to sustain. When the perceived cost of losing is sufficiently high, politicians will be tempted to abandon forbearance. Acts of constitutional hardball may then, in turn, further undermine mutual toleration, reinforcing beliefs that our rivals pose a dangerous threat. And the result is politics without guardrails. As mutual toleration disappears, politicians grow tempted to abandon forbearance and try to win at all costs. That, in turn, may encourage the rise of groups that reject democracy's rules altogether. Mutual toleration and institutional forbearance are closely related and often reinforce each other. Politicians are much more likely to be forbearing when they accept one another as legitimate rivals. And politicians who do not view their rivals as subversive will certainly be less tempted to resort to norm breaking to keep them out of power. These norms have become the foundation of our system of checks and balances. For our system to function, the president, the Congress, and the judiciary must strike a delicate balance. On one hand, Congress and the courts must oversee and, when necessary, check the power of the president. On the other hand, Congress and the courts must allow the government to operate. This is where forbearance comes in. For a presidential democracy to succeed, institutions that are strong enough to check the president must routinely underuse that power. When partisan hatred predominates, politicians' commitment to democracy's checks and balances can be subverted in two ways. Under a divided government, where legislative and judicial institutions are in the hands of the opposition, the risk is constitutional hardball. That is, the opposition deploys its institutional prerogatives as far as possible, maybe defunding the government, blocking all presidential appointments, or perhaps even impeaching the president. Second, under unified government, the risk is abdication of oversight. In a highly partisan world, those in control of Congress may stave off opposition victory by abandoning their oversight role, enabling the president to get away with abusive, illegal, or even authoritarian acts. One more norm that is critical to sustaining a democracy is a deep and abiding belief in the legitimacy of democracy. Democracy's legitimacy begins and ends with culture, the broadly shared belief that democracy is better than any other imaginable form of government. If people believe in democracy and are willing to defend it as a way of life, the precise design of institutions matters a lot less. People must commit to democracy come hell or high water and stick with it, even when the economy tanks, incomes plunge, or politicians misbehave. A solemn belief in democratic legitimacy can immunize the public against the seduction of authoritarian populists. It smooths the way to political compromise and prevents democracy from veering towards polarization and deadlock. It inspires politicians to put the defense of democracy ahead of immediate partisan or personal advantage in case an elected autocrat starts to subvert the rules of the democratic game. And finally, it tends to draw ordinary citizens into more measured positions and more civil behavior. Democracy can't function when politics is dominated by opposing camps of true believers who view compromise as betrayal and dismiss conflicting evidence as fake. An interesting problem in a democracy is what to do about candidates who lean towards authoritarianism or who do not value democracy. In a free democratic country, should the citizens be free enough to elect someone who can be expected to subvert democracy? The assumption is that not every decision in our system is left solely to the voters. As we discussed in our previous slide on legitimacy, in a successful democracy, every member of society is committed to the continuation of democracy. Thus, it is expected that political leaders will recognize extremist elements and take steps to isolate them so they remain on the fringes and far from the centers of power. This is the gatekeeping function. Now, for those who want the game of democracy to continue, what should be the attitude towards government authority? We look for an attitude that can be described as responsible and watchful as opposed to blindly submissive or hostilely rejecting. If people are cynical about authority, government cannot win their cooperation and respect, which results in political polarization and government deadlock, which further alienates citizens, driving them to defect from democratic rules. But a slavish deference to authority and a willingness to surrender one's freedoms to some movement that promises to magically deliver society from all its woes is also bad for democracy. What is required is an intelligent distrust of leadership and a hearty skepticism of demands for the enlargement of government power. Older democracies like ours tend to take democracy for granted. We lose sight of democracy's fragility, become complacent about its norms, and carelessly cross the line into incivility, intolerance, and power grabbing. Ruling parties refuse to listen to the opposition or compromise. Opposition parties retaliate with obstruction and government shutdowns. Partisanship intensifies and the fabric of mutual trust wears thin. This is the path of democratic dysfunction and crisis. Let's talk for a little bit about how democracies tend to be undermined or subverted, so you will recognize it when you see it. Democracy is grinding work. While a family business or an army squadron may rule by fiat, democracies require negotiation, compromise, and concessions. Setbacks are inevitable, victories always partial. Initiatives may die in Congress or be blocked by the courts. All politicians are frustrated by these constraints, but democratic ones know they must accept them. They have developed the patience to weather the frustrations and the conflicts. But for outsiders, particularly those of an authoritarian bent, democratic politics is often intolerably frustrating. For them, checks and balances feels like a straitjacket. Would-be authoritarians have little patience with the day-to-day politics of democracy. Thus, the goal becomes to break free of these constraints. This breaking free, in order to consolidate their power, comes through several fairly standard approaches. One, they can capture the referees, meaning the courts and the regulatory agencies. Secondly, they can sideline the opposition's most powerful voices. And three, they can rewrite the rules to lock in their advantage. Let's talk about these one by one. First, budding authoritarians want to capture the referees. Modern states possess various agencies with the authority to investigate and to punish wrongdoing by both public officials and private citizens. These include the judicial system, law enforcement and intelligence agencies, tax and regulatory agencies as well. If the institutions remain independent, they might expose and punish government abuse. But if these agencies are controlled by loyalists, they could serve a would-be dictator's aims, shielding the government from investigation and criminal prosecutions that could lead to removal from power. The leader may break the law, threaten citizens' rights, and even violate the Constitution without having to worry about such abuse, that such abuse will be investigated or censured. Capturing the referees provides the government with more than a shield. It also offers a powerful weapon, allowing the government to selectively enforce the law, punishing opponents while protecting their allies. So how is it done? Most often, the capture of the referees is done by quietly firing civil servants and other nonpartisan officials and replacing them with loyalists. Institutions that cannot be easily purged may be hijacked by bribery or controlled by blackmail. Judges who cannot be bribed are often impeached, or the court can be increased in size to dilute uncooperative judges. Finally, the courts can be dissolved altogether. Secondly, our developing authoritarian needs to sideline the opposition. Key players are usually opposition politicians, business leaders who fund the opposition, major media outlets, famous religious or cultural figures. Elected authoritarians begin by offering leading political, business, or media figures public positions, favors, perks, or outright bribes in exchange for their support, or at least their silence. Players who cannot be bought must be weakened by other means, often by exile or jailing. These actions are hidden behind a veneer of legality, which is why it's so important to capture the referees. Governments may also use their control of the referees to legally sideline the opposition media, often through libel or defamation suits. As key media outlets are assaulted, others grow wary and begin to practice self-censorship. Business executives can often be ruined economically through the power of the government. Cultural figures, meaning artists, intellectuals, pop stars, athletes, are often co-opted by allowing them to continue their work as long as they, quote, stay out of politics. The quiet silencing of influential voices can have potent consequences for regime opposition. Once key opposition are thought bought off or sidelined, the opposition deflates. The government wins without necessarily breaking the rules. And finally, our authoritarian can change the rules. To entrench themselves in power, the authoritarian must also change the rules of the game. Authoritarians seeking to consolidate their power often reform the Constitution, the electoral system, and other institutions in ways that sound very neutral, but disadvantage or weaken the opposition, in effect tilting the playing field against their rivals. One of the most striking examples of this, of how this is done, comes from the United States post-Civil War Reconstruction. The 1867 Reconstruction Act and the 15th Amendment enabled the mass enfranchisement of Black voters. This posed a major threat to Southern white political control when the percentage of Black men who were eligible to vote increased from 0.5% to 80.5% in 2 years. So they changed the rules. Without ever mentioning race, which was prohibited by the 15th Amendment, they were able to introduce a neutral set of poll taxes, property requirements, literacy tests, and complex ballots, which effectively screened out the poor and the illiterate. Black turnout in the South fell from 80% in 1867 to just 2% in 1912. The disenfranchisement of the African Americans wiped out the Republican Party in the South, locking in white supremacy and a single-party rule for nearly a century. One of the great ironies of how democracies die is that the very defense of democracy is often used as a pretext for its subversion. Would-be authoritarians often use the threat of disorder, such as an economic crisis, natural disasters, or especially security threats like wars, armed insurgencies, or terrorist attacks to justify anti-democratic measures. And citizens are more likely to tolerate and even support authoritarian measures during security crises, especially when they fear for their own safety. Think about our 9/11, when 55% of surveyed Americans said they believed it was necessary to give up some civil liberties to curb terrorism, and that was up from 29% 3 years earlier. For a demagogue who feels besieged by critics and shackled by democratic institutions, A crisis often opens a window of opportunity to silence critics and weaken rivals. It is an opportunity to dismantle the inconvenient and sometimes threatening checks and balances that come with democratic politics. This combination of would-be authoritarian and a major crisis can be deadly for democracy. So we've covered a lot of ground today, but the two most significant elements in a democracy are free and fair elections and the rule of law. Almost 50 years ago, a political scientist named Juan Linz of Yale University recognized this in his book called The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes. And he described three things that any politician who wants the game of democracy to continue, what he calls being a loyal small d Democrat, three things that they must always do. His rules provide us with a great shortcut for recognizing those politicians who have anti-democratic impulses. So first, they must respect the outcome of free and fair elections. And this means consistently, unhesitatingly accepting defeat. Second, loyal Democrats must unambiguously reject violence or the threat of violence as a means of achieving political goals. Political violence is contrary to the rule of law as the means of settling the political disputes in a democracy. And politicians who support military coups, organize insurrections, plot bombings, assassinations, and other terrorist acts, or deploy militias or thugs to beat up the opponents or intimidate voters are not Democrats. Truly, any party or politician that violates either of these two basic rules should be considered a threat to democracy. But the third rule requires more subtle action from loyal Democratic politicians. They must always break with anti-democratic forces. And by those democratic forces, we mean not only the coup conspirators or the armed insurrectionists, but also those political insiders who appear to abide by democracy's rules, but quietly assault them. These are what Linz called semi-loyal Democrats. Whereas loyal Democrats consistently reject anti-democratic behavior, semi-loyal Democrats act more ambiguously. They try to have it both ways, claiming to support democracy while at the same time turning a blind eye to violence and election denialism. While the open authoritarians are visible for all to see, they rarely have the public support or legitimacy to destroy a democracy. The real danger is in the semi-loyalists tucked away in the hallways of power, providing the support that allows authoritarian forces to succeed. And when mainstream parties are dominated by semi-loyalists who tolerate, condone, or protect authoritarian extremists, then democracies are in peril. This is where we will stop for today. If you have written questions on your 4x6 cards, be sure to drop them off in the manila envelope at the back of the room. If your card is blank, put that in the envelope as well, and we will see you next week.